The people making decisions are definitely not interested in long-term economic stability.
Consequences related to everything from nutrition to infections.
Cancer disease can be cured by one small piece of plant that can be lost tomorrow.
Disease emergence, I think a lot of us now believe, is quite connected to the integrity of forests.
People that are bearing the brunt of the disease burden are the people, the impoverished people, people that have minimal resources.
The people making the decisions are really focused on their personal gain and also what's going to be profitable in the short term.
If we're waiting for an apocalypse to happen of that nature, where we're going to blow up in an instant, well, I mean, it's also possible. But I think we're actually slowly killing ourselves right now already.
It's more than time that we as human beings start to change this way to use the nature. We are not the owners of the nature, we are part of that.
Deforestation's on the rise. We used to say that we would lose a football field worth of forest globally every 3 seconds, and right now, every 2 seconds, we lose a football field of forest.
So deforestation is chopping down trees, and it doesn't particularly matter whether that's in the tropics or, in New England or in Canada or wherever. Deforestation happens at different scales. I mean, there's large-scale deforestation, huge swaths of forests being chopped down in various parts of the world. There's small-scale stuff, in neighborhoods and whatever, and they all actually matter to health.
Deforestation is not just in the Amazon. It's a global problem, certainly, and it occurs anywhere from the tundra and the northern latitudes all the way down to the southernmost latitudes. So it affects us all.
I'm in the middle of the Amazon. I live in Manaus City. Manaus City, it's a 2.5 million peso city on the middle of the Amazon. In the Amazon, generally we have different kinds of deforestation, but they generally start with a process of degradation of the forest. The vast majority of the timber extracted in the Amazon is illegal.
We use a mix of satellite monitoring, flyovers, and a plane. And then we also send people into the field, where I've been myself, where you meet the people who are impacted, indigenous peoples who are the best guardians of the forest, and how policies by this current government are encouraging invasions into their territory. So we worked in collaboration with indigenous peoples in the field, and you also speak with workers who've been exploited, because it's really the Wild West in these rural areas, and so there's still a high incidence of labor akin to slavery. So you see a human impact that's really heartbreaking, and how the industrialization and converting this pristine, critical ecosystem into industrial scale agriculture, and how that's impacting the locals there. It's pretty heartbreaking.
Local scale, we know that even in Detroit, there are huge disparities in urban tree cover, right? So there's some parts of Detroit that have lots of trees, and there's some parts that have none. And that's a big deal from a health standpoint, because those trees, one, buffer air pollution, so they can absorb the air pollution that we know makes people sick. They can cool down cities, and cities are warmer than their surrounding areas because they've been paved over. And that's a big deal, because climate change is making heat waves much more dangerous.
Humans, we alter our habitats as we move into our habitats, as we create cities, as we create suburban, neighborhoods, villages. We also alter the flow of water, the hydrology of places. We alter the climate, don't we? And as such, we are creating essentially innumerable changes in our environment, and some of them actually cause some diseases to vanish. You know, it's not all increases. Some do vanish. And on the other hand, we are also allowing for species that are very well adapted to change, like rats, for example. You know, we're creating a lot of habitat that they're able to move into. So by doing that, we are favoring both insect species as well as mammalian and vertebrate species that are very good at adapting to new circumstances. And those species, as it so turns out, oftentimes invest more in breeding a lot, creating a lot of offspring, as opposed to maybe investing a lot in their immune system. And so now, you know, this is not well-proven ground, it's a theory, but one could say that these species that are so well adapted to the generalists, to moving into these new kinds of habitats, and do not invest much in their immune system, then may be more permissive to carrying viruses and other pathogens.
So zoonotic diseases are diseases that are often maintained in non-human animal populations. And there's what we call spillover events in which pathogens move from those animals into humans. And sometimes humans can't transmit those pathogens, so they can get sick because they were in, Lyme disease is a good example of that, where they're in contact with ticks in different regions, forested regions, and they get sick, they can't transmit the disease. Other pathogens that you might get from livestock, for instance, salmonella or E. coli, you get sick by eating contaminated food. You can actually often transmit those diseases to other humans, and there's that person-to-person piece also. And then the other category of zoonotic transmission would be things that, like COVID. We think that COVID emergence happened in a similar way that SARS emergence happened, and some often avian flu occurs this way, and that's in the wet markets in Asia and China largely, where people are selling wild animal for food, and so there's this density of animals, and these markets are very dense, and that's where often spillover occurs.
Connecting dots right now couldn't be easier with coronavirus and wildfires and hurricanes. You know, it's in our faces. Nature is really trying to tell us something, and I think that's the part that we need to work on, is really making sure that we acknowledge and understand how our health is not really about, you know, the foods we eat and the medicines we may take and the things that people would probably hear about going to a doctor. It's really fundamentally about the state of the natural world and the climate. And without those things, it really doesn't matter. Like a lot of these other things are sort of icing. I mean, they're important, don't get me wrong, but they're not going to save us from pandemics and climate change and these other things that are just overwhelming potentially if we don't address them.
Forest is not cut down for fun, it's cut for timber, for cattle pasture, for agricultural production, for palm oil. And so our role is to engage the corporations that are behind and who are complicit in profiting off of the of deforestation.
I have been living in the Amazon for the last 15 years, living and working here. I come from the south of Brazil, and I remember that when I traveled to my grandparents' house. It's an 8 hours road trip. And for the first 4 hours, it's completely forest. And I saw all these forests become smaller, and be changed by soy fields and cattle ranches. And this, for me, since that time was wrong. Around the world come to see this place that is perfect, and this say, change me. How can we just thinking change everything this to put soy and cattle?
There are many different pressures on land around the world, and it's going to be different according to the location. But if we look, for example, at the largest tropical humid forests in the world, the Amazon, the pressures there are clearly driven by cattle ranching, so meat industry, as well as to some degree soy farming, and then to a lesser degree factors like damming for hydroelectricity, gold mining, other types of mining efforts. And then you have people who are also engaging in smaller scale agriculture all throughout the Amazon, opening up new territory. But meat is a major driver.
Cows require often, large habitats to graze it, and when you don't have that, you can tend to chop down more forest. Now, there, of course, deforestation is causing air pollution. We know, there are lots of looks at the production of meat, whether it's grass-fed or, on a conventional feedlot. On a per weight basis, and this is an important distinction, it's at least a couple, 100 times more carbon intensive, because more greenhouse gases in every kilogram of meat than pretty much any plant food and a lot of other meats, actually, especially like fish, seafood. And so from a sustainability standpoint, just on the carbon piece, forget about the water, which is also hugely disparate with beef. It's hard to justify beef consumption.
Second biggest in terms of the climate impact is Indonesia. And so even though Indonesia, it's not the same area of, Brazil, because it's not as big. Like even just to give you things in perspective. So in the past year in Brazil, and just in the Amazon, they lost like 18 Detroits in terms of the scale of, of how much forest was lost. In Indonesia, it's not so much about the square area, but just how thick that carbon is, because it's on peatland, which is like the swamp that the forest stands above. So, and those forests are being converted mainly for palm oil and pulp and paper. So those are the big areas. Congo Basin's critical, but also the boreal, which is in Canada, primarily in Ontario and Quebec, and also in Russia. That sort of green crown that sits above the globe, very important for climate change and for stabilizing the climate.
I've been working in climate change and disease questions for decades, and it's true that most climate change researchers don't think about the link to disease as much. I think we're thinking about it more and more now, and there's certainly people that have thought about it, but it's not most people think about climate change and what it's going to do to the environment and agriculture and living conditions, and they don't think about climate change with respect to how it's going to affect disease transmission.
Here in the Amazon, malaria is a big problem. Dengue, it's a big problem. Yellow fever, it's a big problem. And one of the smallest animals that push this disease inside the cities, it's showing for several scientific studies, showing that the place that you have more deforestation, you have the incidence of malaria much higher, of yellow fever much higher. And this is a problem that the government and not admit or not put this on the screen.
There have been scientists ringing the alarm bell, and one thing that's just like zoonotic diseases and climate change is that there's a great cost of inaction. So there's another study that came out looking at how much it would have cost to end wildlife trade and end deforestation versus the trillions of dollars that the global economy is losing right now as a result.
Even if many of us individuals care about more than money, what makes the world turn, unfortunately, to date, is money and power. So yeah, I think a lot of roads lead right back there.
We're spending around $10 trillion to dig us out of the COVID hole, and that's a low-end estimate. And so that's just one virus, right? But let's just consider the one virus for now. We know that deforestation is a major driver of these emerging viruses. So if we spent what we needed to spend based upon the best available science to reduce deforestation by half in the hot spots where we know these viruses emerge, and if we spend what we needed to spend to really monitor wildlife trade for pathogens, which we don't really do at all right now, so the movement of wild animals around the globe that could be carrying stuff, which has led to outbreaks of diseases. If we spend what we needed to spend to do what's called viral discovery, meaning looking in wildlife for viruses in particular that might jump into people, and if we had better surveillance of the viruses that may jump into people in populations at risk. So think about people working in the wildlife trade, people working on farms in hotspots where the pathogens are first likely to show up. If we did all that, we estimated it would cost around $20 to $30 billion a year, globally. And that sounds like a lot of money until you look at the cost of this one pandemic and realize that if you spent $20 to $30 billion every year for a decade, you'd still only have spent about a few percent of $10 trillion. So the bottom line is that when it comes to emerging infections like coronavirus, salvation comes cheap.
We have to really hold everyone accountable, and this is a problem that doesn't just stay in one country. That's the thing, is it goes everywhere, and it's a challenge to move things along.
How much new medicines we are losing without cancer disease can be cured by one small piece of plant that can be lost tomorrow. The COVID can be cured by a molecule of a frog that we will lose tomorrow because we not stop the deforestation, stop the killing of the forest, and we will not ever know what happened.
I think we're actually slowly killing ourselves right now already. And so that comes in many shapes and forms, right? And some of it we can see right now. So the wildfires in California that are out of control, previous years in Australia, we have a lot of folks who are convincingly showing that climate change is driving a lot of that. So, that's pretty apocalyptic, actually, I find. Also hurricanes, we have a tremendously active hurricane season this year, right? And that too has been attributed to climate change. And that has devastating overnight impacts on many people. But then if we look at slower processes, cancer is another one of them. What we're doing basically by substituting nature for synthetics and artificial products, substances, etc., is probably contributing to our overall cancer burden too. And that is slowly killing us, most certainly.
Pathogens are here, and they're a part of the ecosystem. They've always been part of the ecosystem, and they always will be part of the ecosystem. What we have to learn is how to minimize the disease burden of those. Part of it is keeping a healthy ecosystem, and deforestation, climate change has a lot to do with that. Part of it has to do with having a healthy social infrastructure and be able to be resilient to these changes.
What gives me hope is that knowing, seeing that people are connecting those dots, and we no longer have to do that. The thing that's really important is that people are empowered to hold corporations and governments accountable for this, and for what's happening. And I mean, I think people more and more will become apparent, like we're going to stop deforestation one way or another. We may run out of forests, we might not be around to cut down forests more, but we can also make the decision to end deforestation on our own.
More people in the world are dying from too much food than too little food. And, red meat is I'm not trying to suggest that it is the predominant force in the obesity epidemic in the United States. But many foods that are produced with red meat are shockingly unhealthy. And there are healthier, there's no question there's healthier red meat, which has less saturated fat. And but the vast majority of what we're eating in this country is ground beef that has 7 or often much more higher content of saturated fat in it. And then there's processing that probably makes it even less healthy. So, getting red meat, less red meat in the American diet would be good for all kinds of outcomes. It's hard to do that because there's a very powerful red meat lobby in the United States, and that people really enjoy eating it.
With regards to the tropical rainforests, if you're sitting in Michigan and you don't have any plans right now to go there and to buy a whole big plot of conserved land, for example, then some other things you could do. The red meat discussion that we had earlier, reducing meat consumption is influential. So cutting back on those kinds of consumption patterns will benefit your health as well as the planet's health. That's definitely the case.
It's make pressure in your own government to ask for Brazil, to ask the Brazilian government, the congressmen, the senator house, the president, whatever, to stop what are happening in the Amazon, stop the killing of the Amazon, stop the killing of the people in the Amazon, that defend the Amazon.
Vote on these issues, understand, if you're concerned about climate change, and this isn't just at the federal level, let me be clear, most of the action on climate change is happening in states right now. And so, what's heartening in places like Detroit, you see American car companies, they've got this. I mean, they're moving away from the internal combustion engine. They are electrifying fleets. But, we just learned that in Ohio, there's essentially a sort of mind-boggling story of a utility essentially doing backdoor dealing to protect coal-fired power plants to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And, politicians need to be held accountable for that kind of stuff.
Engaging in more active transportation, meaning walking or bicycling, will indirectly, but very tangibly though, impact the rainforests, because by doing so, we emit less CO2, right? We contribute less to climate change. Climate change, unfortunately, is driving deforestation as well by fueling fires even more.
Initially, you were talking about deforestation and disease, and I think it is much broader than that. Deforestation is a big part of it, but it's really about the relationship between our ecosystem, how we affect and impact our ecosystem, and how that ultimately then impacts disease and disease transmission.
We also have the ability to influence our legislators, our representatives, the people who are in our stead in government, right? So we can certainly write them, we can talk to them, we can engage them on the larger supply chain issues.
We all make choices with how we spend our dollars in this country, and thinking about, are the people we're buying from actually doing stuff around carbon? Are they doing stuff around improving livelihoods? Are they investing in our communities? Or are they simply just trying to make a buck?
We can influence companies too by letting them know that we will not purchase their products if they're of this mind. Or we can have a very similar but positive spin on it and say we would love to purchase their products if they were to consider sourcing other types of products, other types of ingredients. These are all things that are well within our power. We have tremendous power in that regard.
Going to have global warming. We know that we're going to have 1.5, at least 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in the best case scenario. The issue is whether or not we are going to have, there's scales of how much the climate will be disrupted. And the more it's disrupted, the more costly it will be, the more people who are at risk, and the harder it is to accommodate that. So it is a triage situation, but there is scenarios that are better than others, and that's really what we're looking for right now, is the best case scenario.